Hey nerds, Farmer Jesse here. So, in terms of simplicity, almost nothing beats the idea of pouring a bunch of compost down on a garden bed and planting directly into that. Weeds go away, you gain a very loose planting surface without tilling anything, and if things go awry and weeds do come through uninvitedly, probably a word, you can always just add more compost. But there are some important considerations and nuances to using a deep compost mulch system, or what is sometimes referred to as a no-dig system, usually with a great accent. That should be established before going full tilt into this idea. So let's do it. Okay, so let's first describe exactly how this system is set up, just so it's clear how it works and what the heck I'm talking about. There is no one singular way to start a deep compost mulch system, but in its simplest form, it looks like this. A biodegradable weed barrier like cardboard or mulch paper is laid down, and then compost is piled on top of that to a depth of 4 to 8 inches or so, give or take. You can also use an existing garden in place of the weed barrier if it's not too weedy, or an area that had a tarp down for a while. And to clarify, those are not weeds in this shot, but living pathways, which we have done several videos about, so make sure to check some of those out. In some cases, like areas where the soil has been brutalized for a long time, a heavy addition of compost and possibly other amendments added under the guidance of an agronomist, combined with a one-time tillage event, is recommended to get the garden going. Remember, the native soil below the compost will play an active part in your production in a deep compost garden. It's not just the compost feeding the plants. So make sure that that native soil is in the best shape possible. Don't let any sort of never tillage dogma set you or your soil back a couple years. It's not necessary and not worth it. It's important to protect the life in the soil, but sometimes there is not much of anything there to protect, so my advice in the beginning is always just put something there worth protecting. Watch this video here for more info on starting gardens from scratch properly. Anyway, after the compost is down, I like to wait a few months, or at least one wet, warm month, and then you can go ahead and plant. Some people will plant immediately, and if your compost is good, you can do that as well, but I often find that allowing some time for the compost to integrate with the soil greatly enhances the crop's success. That is true especially on rougher soils. Or more precisely, I often find that when you plant immediately, you just get meh production. So now that we're all on the same page, let's talk about the myriad of considerations that need to be taken into account for managing this system well. First, just because we call it deep compost mulching doesn't mean that the compost is just a mulch. Especially when it is several inches deep, the compost acts sort of as an at least temporary growing medium until the plant roots dig deep enough to reach the native soil below. Therefore, the quality of the compost is paramount. As described in the Living Soil Handbook, which when you get it from no-tillgrowers.com, you help support these videos. Thanks. Anyway, as described in that book and on this channel, there are 4 types of compost: fertilizing, mulching, nutritional, and inoculating. I'm not going to go too deep into these, but fertilizing composts are things like composted chicken manure, which can contain high quantities of ammonia and would not do well as a growing medium, as a mulch. The same may be said for some inoculating composts, which are composts that are made with specific microbes in mind and would either be too expensive to use as a deep mulch for the vast majority of gardeners, or too nutrient rich. The most common compost that people have access to and can afford is mulching compost. Sometimes these come from municipalities or sometimes just traditional composters. Mulching compost are pretty much what they sound like. They're mulchy. And the mulchiness has its positives and negatives. On the negative side, they do not tend to be great growing mediums because the nutrients are still being tied up by the mulchy carbonaceous material in the compost. For this reason, I often put a thin layer of fertilizing compost down first underneath of the mulching compost to make up for poor nutrient quality. Another negative is that, unlike finely sifted composts, mulching composts do not hold water very well within the compost itself. This can make germinating quite difficult. However, these mulching composts do tend to hold water well below the compost in the native soil, like a good mulch should. Now, if you have a good composter nearby who makes a well-balanced compost or an affordable raised bed mix, that is ideal. That will contain everything you need to grow a successful plant while also mulching the surface, and this would notably be that 4th form of compost I referred to, the nutritional compost. So what to expect when planting into compost? First, as I just sort of mentioned, expect water to be a little more difficult to manage, at least at first. A lot of people will complain about poor germination for crops directly seeded into deep compost. The reason is that, especially in mulchier composts, water is difficult to hold around where the seeds are trying to germinate. The particles of the compost are just too big and too far apart to retain water. But the other thing that can happen is that the compost simply gets too warm in the sun for some crops like lettuce or carrots or spinach. Remember, compost is dark and absorbs sunlight, making it quite warm in the summer. Lettuce in particular is fickle because it has a strict shutoff at around 75 degrees Fahrenheit where it goes into thermodormancy, meaning it ain't germinate until things cool down. And like I said, with compost being so dark in color, it absorbs more sunlight, thus more heat, making it difficult in the late spring to start crops that are not as difficult when planted directly into soil. You can use shade cloth or the white side of a plastic tarp, or even trees if you have them. I mean, they have to already be there, but if they're around, you can use those things to help cool the surface while seeds germinate. And also, you have to make sure that it stays as moist as possible, maybe adding some drip line underneath of plastic or under the shade cloth. However, this heat issue can also play out with transplants, as the heat of the compost can be quite a dramatic world for young roots, especially at first. And by heat, I just mean literally the sun, like the solar radiation heat, not like compost that's still composting heat. That probably makes sense. And I mentioned drip, but drip irrigation can be irritatingly useless when it comes to compost, as the drips of water will not outwardly saturate the compost like it will soil. Overhead irrigation is often recommended for deep composting, though obviously not everyone has the abundant water that we do here in Kentucky, so overhead irrigation is not always an option. If you have to use drip, you will have to take extra time to align the emitters, the holes, with the transplants and use more drip lines than you normally would. Another issue that comes up with deep compost is that the first year on heavy clay soils can be tough. What happens is that the mulch retains the moisture on the clay surface and creates a mucky mess between the compost and the native soil, which, when the roots run into that, they're none too enthused, to be honest. Also, if you're on any sort of slope at all and the water does not have a clear path away from the bed surfaces, you can lose a lot of your hard work in a short amount of time to erosion. This is especially true of clay soils or poorly draining soils where the water does not penetrate the surface and instead pools up, ready to rush off with your expensive growing material like a thief. Bed layout is important for high rainfall areas. I've increasingly started to lean towards pointing the beds almost directly downhill and raising them up to give the water channels to move out of the garden. Emphatically, you do not want compost rushing off into a waterway, not only because that's expensive, but most importantly to anyone who cares about ecology, which if you're watching one of these videos, that's you. We don't want compost rushing off into the waterways because many composts contain high levels of nutrients such as nitrogen and phosphorus, which can lead to significant pollution. Ecological farms have to be conscious and considerate of all ecology, like even the ecology that is not on your farm, because all farms affect other farms. It's kind of how this whole thing works. So just because it's easier, if you're near a creek or a river or a lake or a floodplain or any waterway, a deep compost system has to be extraordinarily well thought out. Of course, there may be some concerns with excessive nutrients, both in the soil, such as phosphorus, or in the plant itself in the form of nitrates. Luckily, we are starting to see some good research out there about the effects of deep compost mulching on soil and plant health, but there is still a while to go before we have a good idea of what we are actually doing to the soil long term by using deep layers of compost. In fact, my book was referenced in one of these papers, which obviously, as a nerd, was awesome and surprising to see and very intimidating. But this paper suggests what I generally recommend, which is to apply high nitrogen fertilizing compost sparingly, but use mulching composts, those high in carbon, to help balance out the potential for any excessive nutrient leaching. They also mention that when combined with no-till, the nutrient pollution risks may be limited by the increase in soil biology, which can potentially immobilize things like excessive nitrogen, thus making it, well, not a pollutant, but rather wrapped up in soil life, which is awesome. I do think a lot more study needs to be done on the long-term soil risks, but the early evidence is at least promising that as long as you are following the other good soil practices, like the ones we talk about on this channel or in the book, etc., excessive nutrient concerns may not be as high. Emphasis on may. Last thing I'll address is the question of how long does this compost layer last, and that is entirely dependent on your context. If you're in a colder, drier climate, the compost will last longer than if you're in a wetter, warmer climate. The microbiology that will live in the compost and feed off of it will consume it much more quickly where water and warmth are abundant, because microbes go bananas over water and warmth. So this system may indeed be more profitable or worthwhile in a cooler climate than warmer ones, because in warmer climates you have to refresh the compost much more regularly, costing more in both materials and labor. Plus, if you're in a colder climate, that warmth from the sun is going to be super helpful in the spring. I recently did an experiment for how long I could go here in Kentucky Zone 6B without refreshing the compost, which I detailed in this video. And the answer is really about 2 seasons, tops, before the weed pressure returns and the mulching effect for water retention really steps back. But I took it further and went 4 seasons because I just can't be normal. And now it looks in certain parts like there was never any mulch there at all, which the weeds really appreciate, to be honest. They send me cards about it. The tilth of that soil is really nice, but it's basically just soil now. And now I'm trying to see how little compost I can add to kind of refresh those beds, because those beds have been pretty well maintained in terms of weeds. If I can simply apply a couple inches of compost, utilize some cover cropping, and get away with that as a mulch to increase profitability and decrease labor. As I often say, the lower your mulch layer, the higher your weed pressure. Does that make sense? So like as your mulch layer goes down, your weed pressure goes up. This one's weeds. Sorry, left hand. So whether saving labor on the front end is worth it is questionable, especially with all these living pathways that we have, because they can impart some weed seed sometimes, like this. Anyway, more soon from the farm. If you like these videos or any of the videos we do, consider picking up a copy of the Living Soil Handbook at no-tillgrowers.com, or a hat or other merch. Also consider joining our Patreon page at patreon.com/no-tillgrowers. Being a Patreon member enables you to help make decisions about what kind of content we produce. Also, there are some new discount codes over there, which is also rad. That's patreon.com/no-tillgrowers, or just hit that super thanks button. That works too. So, super thanks for watching. We'll see you later. Bye. Okay, so let's